All right, so today I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the data structures that we've been using, especially lists, and start with like kind of a gentle introduction to that. Let me just switch over to my headphones right now.
Did anybody else love Quinton's description about a meaty session? What?
Meaty questions. Maybe we'll have meaty sessions.
Right. Meaty questions. Okay.
At least, yeah. So I'm hoping
I'm quiet now. Eating. Sorry.
Have some questions about it. Let me just link you to what I was thinking we could go through. I have a little bit of a less structured topic for how we're going to talk about it today, but it is something that I have a lot of notes for my past class, and I think that can be our starting point. But before even getting into lists, like just any type of question that people have, we can take about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, and think about things that you've run into that you may not recognize as being questions about lists, but if they're things that you want to talk about. Let's begin with that. Does everybody know what I mean when I talk about when I'm saying the word list? Does that make sense to people? Someone want to tell me?
Describe it, please.
Say that again?
Could you describe it, please?
Sure. Yeah, so let's start from the beginning, like what the basic problem is that we're trying to deal with. So you'll have noticed that when we're creating variables, you have to choose a name that works for the item you're collecting. But what happens when you have multiples of an item that you might need to get? So we call that repeated information. There's a lot of times that might pop up. Can anybody name an example of when there might be some repeated information on a form that we're working with?
Like your name or your, yeah?
A name could be an example.
Your name isn't repeated. I mean, you don't have a collection of names, right? But you have a collection of people who have names.
Yes. So Caroline mentioned a really good example. Anytime that we're dealing with people on a form, sometimes there's one person, sometimes there's two people. Some other examples people can think of?
Pets.
Pets, yep, you could have more than one pet. So there are lots of ways to deal with this kind of issue.
Lawyers, offenses. Sorry, I missed it. Sorry.
Yeah, really any type of incident that you're trying to talk about. So there's different ways to handle that. Like one, on a form, you just have a bunch of blank space to write. And we could mirror that in our interviews too. We could have a big text box where people just type a list of stuff. Or another way to go, which you have already kind of shortcutted around because we've designed the questions and the interview to avoid this problem most of the time. You could use variable names like child1, child2, child3, and so on. But does anybody see a problem with that you might run into eventually? Mariah, I'm gonna call on you. I feel like it's safe to call on the students.
You might have more children than the list, or it could keep asking for children that you don't have.
Yeah, so it gets kind of tedious, right? I mean, first of all, as you're saying, Mariah, like you'd have to make all of your variable names in advance, like child 1 up to maybe child 12. You're like, okay, no one could possibly have more than 12 children, but you'd be surprised some of the time at least. And you would have to deal with a lot of logic for when you show and hide different options for children, like those input boxes. What we deal with in programming to get around that problem is something called a list. So a list is kind of like a pretty common sense thing. It just means it's a way to collect information about multiple items at the same time. Can anybody guess the way that we deal with creating a list in DocAssemble? Not how you create it, but like can you recognize a place where we've used a list and how we maybe reference the different items in it? Anybody remember that little detail? Have you seen something that looks like it's a list? Name one of the variables in our interviews that is probably a list.
Is docket number a list?
docket number. Mia, you're looking like you don't want me to call on you. Is that
Is user list as well?
users
Okay.
is a list as well, yeah. So most of the times that we're talking about a person, we made that into a list. So those are probably like the one you're going to run into the most often. One more that you use a lot is courts. So we made that a list as well, because there are some forms where people might have to write down more than one court's name. And why don't we just play around with this a little bit? This is the really big abstract problem that we're dealing with. How do we work with collections of data? We've said that the problem that we're trying to solve is trying to do really repetitive writing of variables and having to do a lot of logic around when we have those variables. So I sent you a link in the chat, which is also on the Slack, to the lesson, and we can actually do a little bit of interactive playing around with the code right here in this, on this web page. So why don't we start with that? And I'll share my screen. For anybody who joined a little bit later, I'll put that link in there again, but it's also the one on the Slack. An example, let's take this little screenshot from a real form that I've worked with before here as an example, right? So this is a list that allows you to hold up to 9 people. This was a real paper form that I used at Rosie's Place for many years when I was doing intakes. And we're constrained by the amount of room there is on the paper. So there's room for you to list information about up to 9 people. This is kind of a way to think about a list as being like kind of a grid or array. And the difference between a list on a computer and a list on paper is that you can keep adding as many rows as you need. Lists can be kind of one column, like the docket number list. We're not asking for more than one piece of information about each docket number. But if a list has an object in it, like most of our lists, they have an object that's a kind of person, is a kind of object. Then you can think of it as being a spreadsheet or table like this, where you're collecting the same types of information. Those are kind of like the column headings for each item in that list. Let's get introduced a little bit just to the very basic syntax. So that's the first little interactive code box that you can work with right here. And if you are at the right zoom level, you'll be able to see the results at the same time as you see the input. I'm not sure how I can hide this. You can make it full screen as well. Let's see where I'm going to do that. It's not working for me, that full screen button, but hopefully you're all able to see this at the same time. So let's just try running this and see what happens. So we get the items, James, Alice, Richard. Let's read through this. This is Python code that we have here on the left. And what you can see here is we've taken that kind of naive first approach of making a single variable for each child's name. On line 7, we have the same information in a list. So that is controlled by this variable here, use variables. And let's just try changing on line 1. Let's change that to false. So we're no longer in the use variables branch of what's shown on the screen. And before we go on, does anybody have a prediction for what will happen to the output on the right? Let me make that change. So all we've done here is we've just changed line 1 where it says use variables from true to false. Anybody have a prediction for what will happen now when we've made that change? When it was set to true, we saw James, Alice, and Richard. What do you think will happen if we made it false?
Does line 14 then control? So,
Yes.
So that's as far as I know.
Okay. Well, let's give it a try and let's see if we can figure it out backwards from the output. So it looks pretty similar, right? So we're seeing Alexandra, Robert, Lisa, rather than James, Alice, Richard. Anybody have a guess as to what that code on line 14 is doing?
Is it telling us to substitute the children for the child, for each child? So instead of listing each child individually, we're listing the set list children?
Yes, that's right, Nick. So you spotted where those names came from, which is line 7. So let's try it, like adding another name here. Notice it goes in quotes. We have a comma in between each item. Add 2. And run it again. So what should we expect to see now? How many names will be listed on the screen? On line 7, I have Alexandra, Robert, Lisa, Jason, Nick. I know that this might be tricky to switch back and forth a little bit, so take a minute if you need. So a prediction for how many names are going to be shown on the screen. Maybe Aubrey, do you have an idea? I'm just going based on who I can see on my little row.
Well, I already ran it accidentally, so I don't want to.
That's okay.
You
can tell us, and then you can tell us maybe why you think that happened.
So they all showed up, and I don't know why, because I thought below line 9 through 12 would be controlling, and you only have child 1 through 3. But I suspect that's how a list works.
Yeah, so what we did in line 7 right here, this is a list. This is how you write a list in Python. Docassemble adds some more, like basically syntax around working with their version of list, but you can still use the native kind of list. I think this is the easiest way to start understanding it, is with what we have right here. So what is better about this version, or different? What do people notice about this version of working with all of those names that we wanted to work with than the version that's on lines 3 through 5? What's better about working with it on line 7?
You don't have to have a specific variable assigned to each name.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. And what about on the output side? What was different about how we handled the output? Like if we compare lines 9 through 12 to lines 14 through 16, when we want to add a new person to our list. Did we have to make a change here? Yeah, Nick, so explain what you're thinking about.
It's just more efficient because you can just, instead of having to like do all the code of like defining like in like 3 separate places, instead of having to do that, you can just go to one place, add the name, and you're
done. Yeah, I think you just muted your mic there for Nick, but I think that was the last thing you were going to say.
Yeah, it's much more efficient because you can just add the name to one place.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So if you wanted to make your own list, let's just play around with that a little bit. Let's call it like items. Just like any other type of variable, you can assign it on the right-hand side of an equal. And what makes it into a list is just these square brackets. So this on line 9, that's an empty list, a list with no items in it. If I wanted to create a list with some items in it already, I could do it like this. And if I want to show this list here that I'm working with, I just have to make that change here in line 18. So let me put this code that I have so far on the Slack for people to see. I'm going to put it on the code channel. Because I know there's a lot of typing. And someone who hasn't run it yet, any predictions about what will happen when I run this code now? So I've created a new list named items, and I've changed line 18 to refer to that list named items. What will be printed on the screen here? Yeah, well, let's see what happens. Anything look a little funny about like lines 18 and 19 that might surprise you about how I got that result?
I think using the word child could be confusing because we weren't associating it with the name of the list, but it seems like that's kind of irrelevant. It just is a placeholder for every item in the list.
Yes, Matt, you've really caught onto like a really key insight here. So the role of this item here, this variable name here on line 18 that I've highlighted, it's a placeholder that we create. And as Matt said, it makes sense to use names that are descriptive. So using child when we have our list name as items is not so intuitive, but we can, because this variable is being created and destroyed every time that this code runs right here. So I could make it X, and on line 18, what would I have to do on line 19?
Also make it X.
Yeah. So I can make that placeholder whatever I like. It's created right here every time that this code runs. So what we're doing here is the basic of working with lists. We're able to create lists and we're able to output them on the screen.
Is that name X or that variable, is that what you use when you reference the list in like another output? I don't know if that's the right question. If you were wanting to list that list in a document somewhere, is that how you, if you weren't just printing it like line 19, if you wanted the list to be somewhere, is that what you call the list X?
So
or is
X
that
wouldn't
really just a placeholder for this formula?
It's a placeholder that lasts inside this code right here, which is called a for loop. And the for is kind of where that name comes from. And the loop comes from the fact that we're iterating or looping over each item in the list. So it's a variable that only exists inside that loop. So every time I make a new loop, which can include inside a document, I need to choose a new name that makes sense. So it won't remember it outside of that loop. It's not something we can access. That's something called the scope of the variable. And the scope of a variable here is just that we create inside a loop is the loop itself. It doesn't survive outside of that. So if I tried to, this is a really good question. So if I tried to do print X here, I'm actually not 100% sure that this is going to do what it should do, but anybody have a prediction maybe? What do you think might happen when I do this? So one question is, we were just talking about variable scoping, which we could spend a week on that in a coding class. We obviously aren't going to spend that now. So it's okay to just have that be a thing that you remember. Oh, variables have scope. They can't be used everywhere. We should get an error here because this is outside of the scope of this loop. We would know it was inside the same scope if it had the same indentation level and there was no other structure that basically created its own scope. Apparently, that's not how it's working here in this, and I'm not sure if that's just because of this interpreter or if that will happen in other Python code. It's certainly not something behavior you should be counting on, though, that it will still exist after the loop is finished running. All right. Let me just show you a couple of more things about loops, and let me see if it's better. Yeah, let's try this second example here where we're accessing items in a list. So I've already created a list named children. This is an interactive Python interpreter. So when you type something, it'll run the command right away rather than you having to click a run button to run a whole script. So let's just try writing children inside this interactive editor. Before I do that, sorry, actually, I forgot, didn't preload that code. So we have to copy this code here, put it inside. And then you'll be able to keep working with the variable after it's been created. What's going on here? We have our list. It has 2 items in it. And then on the next row, what do you think is happening when I type children bracket 0? And you might have a clue from the docassemble code that you've all been working with.
That's like the first item in the list.
Yes, it is. So why do you think it start where we have a 0 in there? It's an open question to anybody.
I always think of that scene from was it Lethal Weapon? We're going to count down from 3, and then we go. Maybe that reference doesn't work with people.
Yeah, there's no
unmuted to laugh.
There's no really good reason for why it's 0, but just so you know that it's kind of a convention in programming. There's one language which does things differently, which is actually maybe David, you might know better with your data science background. I think MATLAB, if I've been told.
That might be true. I haven't done MATLAB in 20 years.
Okay.
CSS is also one indexed, I believe, and there might be
SPSS. You said
CSS.
Oh, CSS. Really? Okay, that's really confusing. So you mentioned a word, Michelle, index. So what is an index?
An index is that number, is that location in the list.
So what do you think will be shown if I type children 1 in this example?
Are you asking me? Or
sure, anybody. But
Shakira.
yeah, you can answer.
Shakira.
Maybe you needed Shakira. Let's see. Yes. So what have we done there?
You've called the second item in the list. Is that right?
Yeah. So we're outputting it to the screen just by referencing it. And you can think of this as, I like to think of it vertically. I've seen a lot of these diagrams where it's done horizontally. But if you're reading down, it's like a 2-column spreadsheet. We have our index, and then on the right, we have the value that's stored at that index. So we don't have to only use this for getting an item out of our list. We can also add. We can change the value of items, at least this way. And we still use that same assignment operator, the single equal sign. Once I've made a change like that, and I try to output children to the screen again, now I'm going to see that change is reflected there. In Python, this is something where now I'm going to have to, we could just do a little interactive testing and see what happens here. If I want to add the next item to my list, I think I can do this. But I know actually I can't. So what does this error look like to people? What do you think is going on there? This is one of the ways that lists are a little bit different from spreadsheets, maybe, although actually they're not really so different. What do you think that this error here means?
It's because there's only a 0 and a 1 that you're able to assign.
Yes, that's the key thing. So it's saying here, list assignment index out of range. So the range, as you pointed out, Nick, would be 0 to 1. That's how many items are in the list. So when I'm trying to change the value of an item, I can't change the value of an item that's not in the list yet. In some older computer programming languages that are still actively being used, but ones that weren't designed as recently, you have to know in advance how many items are going to be inside this structure, which is pretty similar to a computer science data structure called an array. Lists are a little bit fancier than that, and we don't have regular old-fashioned arrays in Python at all. So you're stuck with the fixed size. In Python, you can change the size, add items, remove items dynamically. The way to do that is with a method on the list. Children is a kind of object called a list. It has methods. We've used methods before with the dot notation. And the one to add an item to a list is called append. So if I want to add Shakira, this is how I would do it. I would just write children.append and then the name of the item that I wanted to add. So now I don't get an error because it's dynamically in the background expanded the size of the list. So if I type children 2, now what do you think I'll get? Caroline, I'm going to call on you.
Shakira.
Yeah. So it's a little bit different to the spreadsheet that I've kind of shown below here because we did the assignment in a different way. But yeah, that's the basic idea. So there are ways to remove items from a list too. I don't think we have to get into those right now. But instead of append, there's a function called remove, and there's a method rather called remove, and a method called pop, which kind of works in reverse to append. You take off the last item that's been added. But those aren't going to be things you do a lot in docassemble.
I have a question about the children append Shakira. So where, oh, okay, I see. We define children. So you have to do children to Shakira, and you're defining that index, and then you're doing the, like, you're appending it, and then you're calling child 2. Is that the?
So what here we did right above there where we got the error, that didn't do anything that was really just an error. It didn't change anything. It was just an example of how you can't do it. In order to get that index 2 to be available to us, we had to call the append method. So let's try that again. So like if we try doing children 3, we're still going to get an error. Doesn't exist yet. But if we did children.append, someone give me a name here. Mia, you look like you want to give me a name. No. Okay.
You can use
I don't know. You should Oh, I was going to say Taylor. Go ahead and put Taylor up there. Tay-Tay.
All right, Taylor. Okay.
Thank you, David. That's great. I was just waiting for it.
So
no arguments about equivalence. Just saying.
We just have to shake off the comparison. So how long is our list now?
I still wanted to say Shakira when you wanted to ask who is what should be on the list. Okay, I'm going to be muted now.
How many items are in our list now that I've just done children.append, Taylor?
Three items, but an index of up to 0, 1, 2. So, right?
It's a good guess. Yeah. Let's just hear a couple more responses, maybe. Anybody have a different prediction?
You're asking how many names are in the list. That's what you're asking, right?
Exactly. Yes.
And when your index is 0, how many names do you have in the list when your index is 0?
No. What I'm asking is right now.
Yeah. No, I'm just
through all the steps we've taken.
People through.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I get the prompt. Yes.
So
yeah.
You guys, when you do children 0, how many names are in the list?
So right now there's 3 names, right?
How many names are in there? You just added Taylor. So where are your children? Where's your so at the top, right? So look at that. At the very one he copied, Jenny and Shakira. How many? The very one. How many names are there?
2, and now we're adding Taylor.
So how do you get Jenny?
It's still 0. Children 0.
How do you get Shakira?
Children 1.
Good. So what are we? So when you have children 2, you have Shakira. You add. Where's the append? Oh,
so,
wait, that's not right.
Yeah.
Beyonce, oh, you did Beyonce. So now
you
we've
might
got.
just not have noticed that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But, keep going.
Oh, okay.
So Quentin, can you scroll up so we see how many names we've got on the list now?
Yeah, and there's a couple of our experiments in there.
All right.
So we started out with
Beyonce.
Jenny and Shakira. We changed the value of the second item, index 1, to Beyonce.
All right.
And then we added Shakira back into our list. But yeah, so you hit on a couple of things there that I think could be worth us digging into. And I think, Caroline, you were focusing on how indexes work and how that can be misleading about the size of the list.
Yeah.
And
if
Nick,
you just did,
maybe
if you
that
just
wasn't
did
your
children, you'd get the list, right? If you wanted to figure out how many children, you could just do children, right?
That's right. So I now have 4 items here. And what would be the index for Taylor? It's the 4th item in the list, but what's the index for it going to be?
Three.
That's right. So I'm not sure, Nick, if you had just maybe not remembered that we had done another append in the middle, which is very possible. And that is worth highlighting too, because when we're working with lists, it remembers the actions that we've taken on it. So just like any other kind of variable, you can change the value of it. When you work with a list, you can accumulate items in it. So that one of the ways we can change it from one time to the next is by adding things to it. And it will remember those changes that we've made. So children 4 is going to give us a list index error. Children 3, as Nick correctly predicted, is going to be Taylor.
And in that order too, Quentin, right? So you change it, but you also change it in that order. So that keeps the indexes associated with the order.
Absolutely right, yes.
Quentin, could you give us an example of when we would want to be amending the range in the middle of the code, and why not just originally make it bigger?
So appending isn't just to change the size of the list. It is to add an item.
Like co-defendants.
Yeah, so you may not always know up front how many items are in the list. And you might want to do that interactively in a DocAssemble interview, like asking for one item at a time or using our list collect method. But you might want to do that with code. A good example in our affidavit of care or custody, you have to list who else is involved in the case. Well, there's some really common options we don't really want to make someone type out. They want to be able to list themselves as being involved in the case. And we want them to be able to list the opposing party, the person who they're getting the protective order or divorce or whatever it might be from. They're going to be really commonly involved in the case involving the children, right? Because we know they're both parents of that child. We can let them check a box to add those names. And the way we actually get those names into the list isn't by asking a question. It's by using a little code block, and we might use something exactly like this, children.append, and we had some existing object called, well, the user 0. So that would be an example of when we're using append in a real interview. I might have made things too confusing. This might be what you were touching on, Mariah, by saying in other languages, lists have a fixed size. You don't really have to worry about that at all in Python or DocAssemble. But just remember, when you see those list index out of range errors, it's probably because you're using the wrong way to interact with that list, or maybe you have an off by 1 error. Like you were like, oh, it has 4 items, so I can get children 4. No, it has to be children 3. That's just something to keep in mind. Since I mentioned the length of the list, I'll just introduce you to one more function, which is len. That's a built-in way to figure out the size of a list. That is something that exists in pretty much every coding language with slightly different syntax. That's the way you do it inside Python. Len is short for length, and you put the item that you want to get the length of inside. So let me see. We have about 20 minutes left. Let's do like a very simple introduction to working with a list inside a DocAssemble interview. And we'll do this a little bit from scratch. So if you want to log into your DocAssemble playground, let's make a new DocAssemble interview. Call it working with lists.yaml. And I won't be able to save till it actually has something in it. Okay, now I know this may take everybody a minute or two. So while you're getting that set up, just explain a little bit about how, let's see. All right. Actually, what I'll do is I won't try to explain stuff before you can play around with it. I'm just going to give you that minute to work with it. So give me a thumbs up emblem if you are still needing a little time to get to the playground. And if someone wants to just take a look and let me know if anyone is waiting for that. Okay, it looks like everybody is here now. So we're going to introduce you to an object block. You might have seen object blocks if you're looked inside basic questions. Some of you have already added your own object blocks, but you probably don't know exactly what they are. Anytime that we're working with an object in DocAssemble, we're going to use one of these blocks to create the object. It works a little bit like the field statement that you've used a bunch, where it's a keyword, a colon, and then underneath it comes a list. So let's make a list that uses a feature that's from our actual interview. And let me think about this actually. Yeah, let's do that. So you're using one that's actually from a real interview. And what we're going to do is make an object that's named people. There's going to be a colon. And then we're going to have the name of our class. A class is a blueprint for an object. When we're working with lists inside DocAssemble, we usually want to use the DocAssemble specific version of those, which has lots of nice features for letting you collect things in a convenient way in DocAssemble. You could also use Python lists, but we're mostly not going to. Mostly we're going to use the DocAssemble version. So we have to create them in this object block. Inside our MA Virtual Court project, we have a blueprint or class that's called people list. So with this block right here, we've now created a new object that we can use in our interview that's called people list. One thing that we have to do in order to get access to the MA Virtual Court repository, which you've probably seen, is we have to include that file into our interview. So let's go ahead and do that as well. That's just docassemble.ma virtual court using initial capital letters for MA and virtual and court, then a colon, and then basic-questions.yml. So let's put what we have right there on the Slack. And let's make a single mandatory question here. And I'm going to reference that variable that I just created, which is called people, inside that. So anybody have a prediction about what will happen when I run this interview that I have so far? And I'll put this whole thing inside the code channel now with that additional little snippet. And let me zoom this in a little bit so it's easier for you to see split screen. Any predictions? All right, well, let's see what happens. This was a whole bunch of new things at once, I realized. So we get this question, will this form include any people? So actually, that's kind of magic, isn't it? Let's see what happens when we change a couple of things in our interview. What else might we want to collect? Well, let's give me a collective noun for a group of people. So in our interview, we have users, other parties.
Students.
Students, sure. Let's click save and run again and see what happens. Oops. Well, we're definitely gonna get an error there, but go ahead and, that's not really the area I want to teach you about though. So that's pretty cool. It's updated to use the word students there. Let's think of one that definitely wouldn't be there. Let's try penguins. So. Any predictions what will happen now when I run this? What screen will I see next? It's okay if you're a ringer. It's okay. We'll keep the conversation going.
It'll say, are there any suits?
I like it. Well, let's see
Will
what's
this
going on
form
here.
include any? Yeah.
Let's go inside and see what's going on here in the background. So this is a little bit more of an advanced detail than we really need to cover here. But I just wanted to show you some of the flexibility that comes with how we're using objects inside the MA Virtual Court project. They can do things like this. So what's going on right here is we're actually referring to the name of the object itself. That's x.objectName. And we're making it plural if it wasn't plural to start. So if I change this and made it our variable name, let's see.
Goat.
Goat. Goat is kind of easy. Let's try a harder one.
Or sheep.
Let's see if it
because
works.
geese is plural. So if you want one that, are you trying to get one that's ambiguous?
No, just
No.
Okay.
you want to show that geese is the plural of goose. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's actually
got
something
it.
really sophisticated here. It actually understands English. This is a library that was built by probably like 10 years of work by academic researchers to take the English corpus of language and let us make little functions like this, noun plural.
Quentin, since you're right here in the source, I think it's helpful for people when you can't figure out why your code is doing something unexpected, that you can see which YAML it's coming from. So I think it's helpful when you see this that it's coming not from the YAML you just wrote, but from the basic questions YAML. I think that can throw people a lot.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people have started to kind of figure that out. So like one other thing to say, which I've said to a lot of you individually, is you're never stuck with this question. So if you wanted to, this is a little complicated to copy and paste, but you can always write your own version of the question if you wanted to ask it a slightly different way. By using the questions we have, you get some defaults, so it's not a blocker. But when you want to go back in and make the language better, or change the way the question works, maybe putting two fields on the same screen, you can. And this is one way to do it, clicking the source button and just seeing and copying and pasting that into your own code. So there are a lot of things going on here, which I won't get into too much, but one of the cool things about DocAssemble is we can write generic questions, ones that work for any of a certain type of object, and we just write them once. And by using things like this, like if we want it to be plural or singular, when we want it to reflect the object's name, we can do pretty neat things without having to write a lot of repetitive code or copy and paste it. When we use generic object, that keyword here, we say the name of the class or blueprint. Remember, people list was the name of the blueprint. And it's going to limit this question to everything of that class. And then we use the X to stand in for the actual object's name. So that's one way that working with objects is really powerful in DocAssemble. You can avoid having to write boilerplate questions again and again, copying and pasting. Actually, it's kind of the opposite. You only write the boilerplate once and you don't have to rewrite it, I guess is a better way to say that. Let's try not using that feature. And in the last 10 minutes, I'll just show you a little bit about the very basics of working with lists.
Capital L?
Yep, good catch. All right, let's say we didn't have what are the magic variables that we need to work with when we're using a DocAssemble list object? we'll kind of give you a really quick introduction to those, because you may run into errors that reference those, even if you're using questions that are built into our basic questions file. So I want to just let you get a little bit of a sense of that. And let's go back to naming this people and this people. So the key here is that we don't have a generic question like this one that works for any DA list. DA list is the built-in docassemble list object. So now we're going to get prompted, and we're going to get to see the questions that you need to answer in order to show a list of people on the screen. So the first thing that we get told we need to define is something called people.thereareany. I have found a lot of people, this makes like pretty intuitive sense to. So if you're sitting down with the client on the other side of the table and you're having to get to the section of the form that asks for the names of their children, what would be the first question you would ask? What does this remind you of asking? Any volunteer?
Do you have any children?
Yeah. So that's the way we have to answer that question in docassemble. We have to define a variable called people.thereareany. So let's create a question that does that. This is kind of an awkward question. What type of question should this be? What type of field are we trying to fill in here?
Yes, no.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yep, and this is kind of the shortcut way when we only have one question on the screen. We can just use that yes, no, and then a bracket and the variable name. It's the same thing as using a field statement and doing does the same thing here. These are equivalent. One difference is the way that the screen looks. When you use this style, you get buttons, which can be a little bit easier to interact with when it makes sense to only have one question on the screen. All right, so we've gotten past the first hurdle. Do you have any people? Let's answer yes. Let's see what happens. Okay, so now we're getting a reference to a variable people0 that could not be looked up. What do you think is going on here? So we've asked, do you have any people? What would be the next question you would ask when you're sitting across from your client?
Who are they?
Yeah, who are they? Or even going one step smaller.
What are their names?
What's the name of the first person? Let's say.
Okay.
No, that's what are their names is a good question to ask. Yes, but a smaller prompt even might be, what are their names? What is their name? And now we're going to go back to using the field statement here. We're right now trying to define people0. Okay, let me put what we have on the Slack here for a minute. I know we're rushing and you might have run into syntax errors. I'd love to show you the three things just so they're on the screen for you to look at. I see a chat here. We have a hard stop at 2, so we really have 5 minutes. So I won't have a lot of time for questions, but so you can go back and review this later. Okay, I'm going to answer yes. What is the person's name? Okay, we get another error. So what does this question remind people of? Again, sitting across the table from your client.
Are there any
Right.
more people?
Are there any more people? Yes. And that's going to be another question of the same type as the do you have any people, right? Which was
Like a yes, no.
exactly. All right, let's see what happens here. See what we can teach in the next 4 minutes. All right, so do we have any people? What happens if I click no? What do you think will happen here? Will this work? I didn't show anything because our list is empty, and that's fine. We have it is something, the question's been answered, it just happens to be empty. If I say yes, I get asked for the person's name. I get asked, is there another? Now if I click no, what do you think we'll see on the next screen? Maeve, it's okay to answer.
The person, I don't know, the person's name, I'm not sure.
Yeah, exactly right. But what if I said yes here? Let's try it. We get a new thing we haven't answered. So now we don't have a definition to the question people one. So how do you think, one way we might solve that is to take our question here, right? And change it to people one. We could keep going up to people 12. Well, obviously that's not going to be the right way to do it. As we just said, that's kind of why we're working with a list, is we don't want to keep having to have special questions for each person. The way to do that is by introducing a new magic variable, which is the letter I. I is a placeholder variable. That means our question will work for anybody, for any item in that list. So think, when you see I, think of it as being index, and it's a magic placeholder variable. So now if I run this again, I've replaced that specific index, the 0, or I could have gone up to 1 and so on, up to as many numbers as I cared to type. Now it will work indefinitely. I can keep going as long as I like until finally I'm say no, and then it can show me the full list of items. So those are kind of the magic variables that let you work with items in a list. We need to have these questions answered to be able to work with them. There are some different ways to work with lists. This is kind of the built-in, most common way.
I'm going to stop the recording because I have to jump off, but I'll make you the, oh, I can't make.
Oh, well, I already am the
You are the host.
That's probably
all
why.
right. Well, then I think my recording is going to stop.
But you'll be able to
continue
join
on.
your next meeting still?
Oh, I hope so if you're the it will find out. It may kick you off. Forewarning.
Okay.
Cheers.
Right.